What up, y'all? How we doing? It's your boy Coffee Kid back with another episode of The Observation. Hope everyone's had a good week. Today we have a video from William Lane Craig debating Ben Shapiro about the historicity and the reliability of Jesus and the claims around his resurrection, how that lines up with the historical affirmations, how that lines up with historical accuracy, what it takes to even gather historical evidence, and what, propagates a historical document or a historical book as reliable, is some of the themes of the conversation, but simply within the context of Jesus. And I think it's important to note what we accept as truth in today's society. For example, Plato, Da Vinci, some of the Greek and Roman era authors. As historians and as contemporary learners, we hear about those documents, we hear about those people, having never looked, most of us, including myself, haven't looked into the historical timelines of what they were documenting, what they were writing about, and what their purpose was for writing, what their evidence was for writing, But generally, we accept those things as truth. Like, we accept Greek mythology, at least the authors had a clear intent behind their writings of it, and a clear timeline of when these things were written about and why they were written about, right? And as a society, generally, with how the educational system portrays these things, we don't view them with skepticism, even though they might be just as ancient as biblical writings, or even older. So it's interesting what our society accepts as truth. No one is out here saying anything Da Vinci said was a lie, or anything Plato said was invalid, or things of that nature. Oftentimes these figures are the benchmark for what writing was and what it eventually became, and they're looked to with great awe, for example. So I think that's an interesting dynamic to pay attention to when we think about the historicity of the Bible and the historicity of Jesus in and of itself. I would say, juggling your mind. Why do I believe this historical time period and the writings of it without really looking into it, but I don't believe this, or don't believe the historicity of the Bible, and I've never looked into it? That's a common question that I would pose on people, and kind of rethink. But nevertheless, I'll dive right in. Appreciate y'all for tuning in yet again. If you made it, go ahead and subscribe and like the video if you find this content interesting. If you find it engaging or inspiring, that would be much appreciated. Get your boy running on the algorithms, whatever it takes. But without further ado, we can jump right in.
Got this idea of a God that's present in the universe, and that has a moral component to him, is the unmoved mover, all of these things. So why do you need the idea of a revelatory God who speaks to human beings?
The arguments that we've discussed already narrow down the field of the world religions to basically the great monotheistic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or perhaps deism. The question as to which of these is true, I think, stands or falls upon the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was? Jesus claimed to be the decisive self-revelation of God, and I believe that we have good reasons to believe that those claims were true, and that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets. And finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense, even. That there are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves Messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy, going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, "I am God," which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that'd be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this: why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then, how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
On the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim there's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s.
Yes.
And there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have and they still do that 20 years after his death. That's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experienced it. Right. So, especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's sufficient.
I doubt this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up, so I wouldn't know. But the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then
that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. I'm thinking of the ones that Paul transmits to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're on pretty good ground there in terms of the earliness and the multiplicity of our sources for the life of Jesus.
So let's talk for a second about sort of the...
Wow. Very interesting video. I think he makes a good point towards the end about the time gap between the event of the crucifixion and the witnesses documenting it, and the multiplicity of those witnesses, right? There's multiple witnesses. They get scattered throughout the Mesopotamian region, the region surrounding Israel over the next 30, 40 years, and they're still, independently referring to these same witnesses of during Jesus' lifetime and his crucifixion, right? They're documented in different areas of the world, telling the same succinct story, right? If you go to the books of the New Testament, these stories are so similar from separate witnesses that got scattered, right? So the multiplicity, the timeline, the references to the Old Testament, right? If you don't want to believe the Old Testament, well, look at the Jews. The Jews are the evidence that the Old Testament is still valid, right? Because these are still their holy books. So it's interesting how even Jesus, according to what the New Testament witnesses say, how accurately he quotes from the Old Testament, which was 400 years before the birth of Jesus. The last Old Testament book, the last book of the prophets, was 400 years before Jesus' birth. So even the life of Jesus and what the witnesses were quoting him saying is directly from the Old Testament and what the Old Testament prophets said about the one who would come. So it's really like it's a the Bible, if you look at it as a historical document, it trumps in terms of evidence, multiplicity, a lot of these historical documents that we view as truth today. And the timeline of it is even crazier. So something to note. With that said, I'm just gonna read from an Old Testament passage, Isaiah 53, starting in the 4th verse. And this is one of the examples of an earlier prophet in a historically corroborated book in the Old Testament. An old prophet referring to the archetype of Jesus, or one who is eerily similar to the claims of the New Testament and what Jesus did. And the parallels are very, very accurate. So with that said, Isaiah 53 verse 5. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death. Though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Think about that. The claim of the New Testament is that Jesus died, was led like a lamb to slaughter, to crucifixion, and pierced for our iniquities. Think about it. When they confirmed that he was dead, they stuck a spear in his side. Pierced for our iniquities. Remained silent the whole time because he was fulfilling prophecy during that very action. During that very section of the New Testament. So, it's interesting how you have an event 400 years later fulfilling a prophecy from 400 years earlier. Think about the historical relevance of that. What other historical book has that type of connection, has that type of overlap in their timelines, yet it still comes to fruition? So that, I think, is a unique aspect of the Bible, and there's other examples of that aside from the crucifixion of Jesus, of Old Testament prophecy coming true in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It's really an interesting topic, but I think the historical validity and the historical accuracy of the Bible begs the question for those of you who might be on the fence, those of you who might not believe. I think that warrants, as Dr. Craig said, that warrants another look, right? You don't have to necessarily believe what the disciples were saying, right? At the end of the day, we understand that they say these things happened, and they recorded it very, very, very close after they witnessed it, and after the recorded event happened. So you can dial it down to hallucination, you can dial it down to a lot of naturalistic theories about what they saw and what they were actually recording, but you can't deny that these things happened historically. So that fact alone, I think, warrants another look into what the New Testament is claiming, how it lines up with what had been being predicted for the whole existence of Israel leading up to that point. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating, just as a historical book, aside from the supernatural and spiritual implications of what's going on. But I think I'll leave it there. If you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed the historical takes and the historical perspective, please leave a like, comment. You know, if you are of a different religion or a different worldview, I would love to chat with you in the comments or discuss your thoughts on this video. But really, really cool video overall. So hope y'all enjoyed it. But with that, it's been another episode of The Observation with your boy Copper Kid, where we talk about what it was and what it is. Appreciate y'all for watching. Peace.